Hi, and welcome to episode 11 of the Dad Nobody Wants to Listen to You About New York podcast. This week, I want to look into the cost of living in New York. New York City and London are called the greatest cities in the world, but they're not easy places to live. New York City is home to more than 8.3 million people and is ranked one of the most expensive cities in the world, next to Singapore at number 1. London was rated 28th. The cost of living in New York is higher than London, and it'll cost approximately $9,000 to maintain the same lifestyle in London for $7,000. Why is this? New York City residents tend to earn a lot more money than Londoners, and businesses are naturally therefore able to charge a lot more. And without any contest, I think New York is more expensive than London. The appetite for price gouging is much greater in New York than in London. It's like, how much can I possibly charge? And you don't really feel that so much in London. UK residents also pay a lot more tax than the US. The tax burden in Europe is far higher than in the States, but on the other hand, it also means that a lot of what we would call public services in England is much more expensive in the States, because you have to pay for that on top of the taxes that you're already paying. The difference between New York versus what you'd see in London isn't as large for local income, for instance, but it is significant for sales taxes. You have a relatively low sales tax within New York, but in England, in the UK, you have a value-added tax of 20%. So, how much does it cost to live in New York versus London? And why are people willing to pay so much? Well, those who listen to my podcast on housing will find out that rent prices in New York are about 47% higher than living in London. A one-bedroom in the city centre is about $3,800 in New York City. In London, a comparable apartment is about $2,600, so rent is a lot cheaper in London. New York, people finding that they can be paying $1,800 a month for a really small studio. It's maybe in a walk-up building, maybe no laundry, maybe little heat. London, you could be paying probably $1,300 for the same, but with that, you'd probably get a 6-bedroom house. And you'd probably have a room in that house, but you'd have plenty of space. You'd probably have laundry, you'd have a garden, probably have a gardener, a housekeeper maybe. So although, of course, not everyone's living like that, but for the sort of money that you're going to be paying in New York, you can have a much, much nicer apartment and a better standard of housing in London. When it comes to grocery prices, they're about 70% higher in New York. Common food items are between 27% and 220% more expensive in New York. And yet groceries in London are really comparatively cheap, and most people are completely shocked at the prices when they come over to London. Prices are nearly double in New York compared to the prices in London. You may spend $3 or $4 for a yogurt in London, but you wouldn't be at all surprised to be spending $7 or $8 for a yogurt in New York. My personal experience of that was when I was staying in Brooklyn and I shopped in a very, very cheap local supermarket. It was a big supermarket, as big as any supermarket you would find in London. But I was astonished how, with just basic things such as toilet paper, milk, butter, eggs, not a lot of things, the end bill was $230 US. The equivalent probably in England would have been about $110. But in a way, that's probably the culture of New York, because New York is all about spending money. Wherever you go, things are expensive. If you want to eat out, it's expensive. If you want to go and see a show, it's expensive. And I think they're just not very affordable ways to go out and have fun with friends and family in New York like there are in the UK. It just doesn't exist. You could say probably a lot of young people in London don't need to go out because they tend to have somewhere slightly nicer to live and they can meet all their friends and family at home or in their gardens. Of course, as I mentioned in another podcast as well, the tipping culture is very different in London. In New York, it's huge amounts, anything up to 25%. In England, it's usually between 10 and 15%. As I showed in my podcast, the added costs of service charges, taxes, and then gratuities on top of your meal make it extremely expensive to eat out in New York City. Alcohol can be a lot cheaper in London. You can get a pint of beer for about £4, but there are, of course, lots of bars where you can spend £19 on a cocktail. It's the same in New York, where you can easily get a $25 cocktail and probably feel really stupid afterwards. So yes, living in New York is extremely expensive. Food is expensive. Rents are expensive. A lot more than London, but you're getting paid a lot more and taxes are a lot less. The average New Yorker tends to make, on average, about $1,400 per week. In London, the average is probably less than $1,000, or even about $800. So local purchasing power in New York is about 90% higher than it is in London. It's always a lot of fun when people come over from the UK to visit people in New York and they see how much a couple of coffees cost, nearly $15. But you've also got to factor in taxes. In the United Kingdom, the tax rates are extremely high, and they're the same for the same country. And as you earn more money, it's a progressive tax. You pay a higher marginal tax rate. The UK has 4 tax brackets. Starting at $12,570, you don't get any tax. And really from that basic of $12,570 up to $50,000 a year, it's 20% tax rate. And over 50 to about $125,000 a year, it's 40%. And over £125,000 a year, it's 45% income tax. So the UK's highest tax bracket is about $125,000 before you pay 45% tax. Compared to the US income tax brackets, that's a relatively low threshold for such a high rate. It's also a little harder to find out what New Yorkers pay in tax because, unlike the UK, you also have state tax. It's not very easy to work it out, but it is well known that New York has the highest top personal income tax rate in the country. We also have to factor in the consumption taxes, which are the taxes on things you buy. These are called sales taxes in the US or value-added taxes in the UK. The value-added tax in London is set at 20% for most goods and services. New York total sales tax is about 9%. But there is one crucial difference. In the UK, taxes are built into display prices in the stores. In the US, you have to do all that mathematics on your own. It's part of how you budget, it's how you reckon things in the shops. You have to see that the tax is separate from the cost of things. It's 2 separate things. And it makes it feel more of a burden in America, even if it is less money. So you might think, why are things less expensive in London when there is a 20% tax on things as well? Well, it comes to how businesses are paying taxes. That process depends very much on where you are. So, of course, you ask yourself, why are London and New York so expensive? Short answer is, you have more than 8 million people living in New York and they want to live there. It's the top city readers' dream, according to a Time Out magazine survey, for people to live in New York. London and New York are both huge financial and political hubs, and they have a broad set of industries and job opportunities. I think a lot of people feel that the job opportunities and interesting sectors are much greater in New York City than they would be in London. Both cities have huge nightlife and cultural events. It's a $35 billion industry in New York that creates nearly 300,000 jobs and generates nearly 700 million of tax revenue for the city. But those stats are probably before COVID. During the COVID thing, 45% of businesses lost money during COVID-19. But there's been a rebound, and this year, most of the jobs are back and people are doing very, very well again. The The London economy makes up for nearly 25% of the holiday or leisure economy. The city is responsible for generating nearly £42 billion or 53 billion US dollars in 2019. Now, during the pandemic, it's estimated that the UK nighttime economy lost about £36 billion of business, or roughly $46 billion. The other great advantage of living in New York or London is that both cities don't really require a car to get around. Both cities have fantastic public transport facilities. Cities that are walkable and nice, good cities are more expensive and become more expensive because they're valued. And if you make places better or you make better places, people vote with their feet and become more expensive. But New York's fares are a fixed $2.75. But in London, the further you travel, the more you pay. Also, the subways in New York are 24/7. There are more subway stops in New York City than all the other cities in the United States put together. But one thing that is certainly true about New York is that no matter what the price, because of the excitement of living in a place like New York, people will put up with the dirt and the prices no matter what. In the last part of this podcast, I really want to discuss the cost of living in terms of the prices of food in New York and why is food so expensive, and also to talk about food fraud, which is one of the elements that's increasing the prices of food as well as giving people bad value for money. But before we move on to that, it is important just to stress that although London is a wonderful place, there is a cost of living crisis at the moment. London rents have increased by 17% in 2022, which is the highest year-on-year increase since 2007. And also it's well known that people in London are spending as much as 50% of their weekly or their monthly income on rent. And in 2021, the last time that I've managed to find some studies, it was about 45%. So rents have been going up immeasurably. So yes, London is a very expensive place to live. It's not as expensive as living in New York, but nevertheless it is up there with the highest cities. But I want to talk about food prices. And I want to mention quickly about London as well, because food prices in London have also gone up. And there are many reasons for that. Some of them are very similar to the reasons for high prices in New York. But there's some very unique problems that exist in the United Kingdom and London in particular. Firstly, I think there was this devaluation of the pound, which made imports more expensive. This happened just after the Brexit vote. People also found that with Brexit, the impact on prices made trade very, very difficult because things were more expensive to ship abroad and very much more expensive for people to buy things from England when you were abroad. A third reason is that the end of the free movement of labour. As you probably know, before, when we were part of the European community, people in the whole of Europe could come and live in any of the countries and work there as well. Well, that stopped as soon as the United Kingdom left the European community, and that caused labour shortages. And that meant that the people who were left were in short supply, and they could also ask for higher wages. The other thing is inflation caused by some very bad economic decisions made by the UK government. And people have probably heard about this disastrous budget that was done by our Liz Truss, who was the shortest in office Prime Minister in history. I think she lasted about 6 weeks because of that. But that caused huge problems with inflation. And it was exacerbated also because of the problems in the Ukraine with the gas prices and energy prices as well. The huge rise in energy prices, whether it was gas or oil, has caused everything to go up in price, particularly things that required heat and manufacturing. But back to New York City. Why do New Yorkers also feel so poor? Although it's not talked about in the same way as it is in England as a cost of living crisis, there are plenty of videos out there of Joe Biden talking to the public about how he's trying to make sure that prices are going down and that inflation is under control. But really, it affects the middle-class New Yorkers like no time before. I was amazed to see how gas prices had gone up to $3.98 a gallon. I still remember it as being even cents for the gallon. But that's still nothing compared to what you would pay for petrol in the United Kingdom or in Germany. But rents, gas, inflation, and groceries have contributed to a huge cost of living crisis in New York. Inflation is up 7% compared to last year, although the inflation rate is slightly falling. But the main grocery staples such as eggs and milk and butter are still up 10% year on year. If you compare your shopping cart from 2022 to 2023, one of the biggest contributors to the rise is eggs. 18 eggs in 2022 would cost a New Yorker on average $1.59. Now it's gone up to $4.89. That's a 207% increase in 1 year. Looking at my own receipt for the Brooklyn supermarket I went to, I then compared that to prices of last year. I found that the oat milk my wife has bought is 40% more expensive than it was a year ago. Cheese slices, 25% higher. Half a gallon of chocolate milk, 42% higher. A pound of ground beef was 37% higher. Bread, 27% higher. It's just crazy how the prices have gone up. So I wanted to find out why. New York has tremendous inflation, and it has suffered from some of the other issues such as the energy crisis caused by the problems in Ukraine. But also the workers in the United States of America have a very different situation from the workers in the United Kingdom. Workers in the United Kingdom, feeling the effects of inflation on their pay packets, have been going on strike in the public sector and private sector in order to try to get matching pay raises to the rate of inflation. Well, as everyone who works in New York knows, it's almost impossible to do that because you are paid in the US what you can be replaced for. While I was there and I spoke to some of my hotel management colleagues, they told me that the unions have been fighting to increase the pay for all their line staff. In the main, New York workers have not been able to get large increases in their salaries. Okay, there's a shortage of workers, and in some businesses, the shortage has meant that it's giving them a more powerful position, and they can turn around to their employers and say, well, pay me more, I'll go. That certainly happened in the restaurant and catering industry. But in a lot of the other industries, it's not the case. In the United Kingdom, a lot of the public sector workers and private sector workers have been threatening industrial action unless they get inflationary equal pay rises. And certainly in the terms of hospitals and fire unions and police and everywhere else, most of them have managed to settle with the government with increases in pay that have matched the rate of inflation. But the problem with that, as would be the problem in New York, the workers are not prepared to take a pay cut when the inflation rate starts falling. If you listen to my right-wing New York friends, they all talk about the impending fall of New York. They say that New York is becoming a shadow of its former self and that people are fleeing to lovely, hospitable climes like Florida. I suppose you could argue that the states are making tremendous changes in their political actions. Amazingly, with a population way smaller than the state of Florida, New York City is spending nearly twice the amount in municipal spending. In the next fiscal year, New York is scheduled to spend $229 billion, while the Sunshine State of Florida, $117 billion. The spending in New York State, in Albany, which is the central power of government, it's gone up 32% in the last 4 years. So this has a major impact on people's taxation and the cost of living. Last year, CNBC did a really interesting study into why groceries cost so much now. And I wanted just to quickly play you the beginning of that documentary.
I guarantee you, anytime a product can be passed off as something more expensive, it will be.
Prices are very dynamic. They move up and down every single day.
An orange that's grown conventionally and an orange that's grown organically, I think they're going to have the same vitamins in them.
Organic food is not healthier or safer for you.
Fraud happens more with more expensive foods.
Cheaper oil is added to the more expensive oil, and the label still reads 100% extra virgin olive.
There's a lot to take in that soundbite, but one of the things that really stood out at me and something that I wanted to examine in a lot more detail is food fraud. If food can be for a moment likened to the drug industry, it's a massive industry, this fraud. It's costing $40 billion a year according to the Food and Drug Administration. That's nearly 10% of all commercially available food in America is adulterated in some form or other. That's like standing at the checkout counter and 1 item in 10 is not what it says it is. Why isn't more being spoken about this? What's going on in London? The same thing. It's so bad in England since the famous horse meat scandal that the Food Standard Agency has just launched a fraud hotline. So you can call and report if you feel that somebody is doing something fraudulent with food. A lot of the food in England that is labelled as coming from Britain doesn't come from Britain. It comes from South Africa or Eastern Europe. And it's costing over £2 billion in England. That's $2.5 billion a year in fraud. The Food and Drug Administration in New York calls this economically motivated adulteration, or EMA. It's counterfeit foods. It's rip-off people in the streets that claim they're selling you the latest Nike trainers or the latest designer goods. It's restaurants selling you food that you think is really what it says it is, but it isn't. It's little shops and bodegas that sell you olive oil and you think it's 100% virgin olive oil, but it's not. It's been diluted with cheaper substitutes. It's chicken and beef that's been injected with liquid to make it heavier. Or as one of my friendly New York chefs told me just the other day, that he was opening up very expensive sirloin steaks and he cooked it and it fell in half. And he realized that some unscrupulous meat suppliers are taking filet mignons, cutting them in half, and then gluing a much cheaper side of meat onto it, and then selling the whole thing as a filet mignon. An American chef of mine just told me a story today, how cooking oil coming from China is not quite what it seems. It turned out that people were taking roadkill and dead animals, boiling them down to extract the fat and oil, and then using that to adulterate cooking oil and selling it off as pure cooking oil. The very respectable consultants Deloitte have done a food fraud in the UK report that was launched this year. Like drugs, wherever there's a high-value item, the suppliers will try to make as much money as they can. And that means in terms of food that they will cut it with chalk, with sawdust, with starch. And this happens with cheese, this happens with meat, it happens with spices and herbs. Some spices are so expensive, so you think you're buying some original spice, but it turns out that probably only half of it is an original spice. But because it's ground down and spices smell so pungent, most people can never tell. Another big scam that's going on in New York at the moment is white fish. My chef friend told me he's absolutely convinced that the average consumer would never be able to tell one white fish from another. The scammers know that. And so they're buying all this cheap white fish from places like Thailand, bringing it over and selling it as the most exotic cod or white snapper or sea bass. But it's not just as simple as saying that the honey you buy has been adulterated, although there's a good chance of that being the case in New York City. Organic food is the latest area where things are going seriously wrong. In New York, 69% of people in a recent survey have admitted to buying organic food, but 20% of those people don't even understand what organic food really is. And then this is an amazing fertile ground for the crooks, because with organic food on average being 25 cents more expensive than regular food, there are huge profits to be made. Demand for organic food in New York is at an all-time high, And in 2023, it's estimated that it'll be an $80 billion business. And why? Because consumers in America are very attentive to their health and are prepared to pay more for what they perceive is even better for them, and even though they're not really sure that's the case. And it's well known that fraud is rampant. In 2020 alone, 370 food operatives were closed down because of fraud over illegal organic food. Like a lot of European countries, in the United States, you put an organic food label on your item if it's organic. There are two types. There's one that's 100% and there's one that's 90%. Anything less than that, you don't actually get to put an organic label. But you're still allowed to list organic foods that are in the ingredients of the item that's being sold. So you can give a misleading impression that the whole thing is organic somehow. And this is allowed if there's at least 70% organic produce inside the item. But as you heard in that soundbite, it's well known that there's no difference between organic food and regular food in terms of nutritional value. It's all really to do with your concern about how food is grown and the use of pesticides and other things that may cause you some harm. So you can see the temptation to produce fake organic food is massive, and the problem is growing all the time, almost exponentially. So food fraud can affect anyone. It's a collective term. It's used to encompass the deliberate and intentional substitution, adding, tampering, or misrepresentation of food, the ingredients, or food packaging. It's a false or misleading statement made about a product. Deloitte explain in a lot of detail about what food fraud is and the type of stuff that's been uncovered, such as tampering with expiration dates on cheese and chicken, or products that falsely claim to be organic in order to be sold at higher prices, sunflower oil made to look like extra virgin oil through the addition of other chemicals, or meat waste, which is prohibited for human consumption, found in minced beef or oxtail, low-grade coffee fraudulently labelled as 100% Arabica, meat with falsified documentation concerning its geographical origin, undeclared peanuts used as a bulking agent in other nut products, counterfeit alcohol, reusing original bottles, fraudulent labelling and the blending of cheaper wines, or dietary food supplements containing illegal substances. A recent New York Post article discussed how New Yorkers are spending on average between $700 and $800 more per month on the common goods than they did just 2 years ago. I spoke to some shoppers in the supermarket that I was in Brooklyn, and they were noticing how that companies are now producing boxes of cookies that used to have 12 cookies in them, and now there are only 4. And I've seen the same thing happen in England, where chocolate bars are smaller than they used to be, but the same price. This is price gouging, pure and simple, and something that is rampant across New York at the moment. But the sad reality is that not everyone is a middle-class New Yorker, and it's the poor and the retired who are suffering. People cannot afford to eat meat because it's too expensive. Some people are not getting good nutrition even if they're vegetarians. Some people have sicknesses. They're avoiding meals because of the cost of living crisis in New York. People are saying that they're just not eating proper food. They know they should be eating it, but basically they cannot afford to eat proper food anymore. Lastly, I just wanted to end on a funny note, because another one of the big problems in New York is pet food. It's well known that pet food as an industry in the United States is a $232 billion industry. But it's not without its problems. There's a huge amount of counterfeit pet food going into tins. It's not what it says on the tin. There's been some suggestion that pet food manufacturers collude with veterinary practices and allege that the food in the tins has every nutrient that the animal could ever need, which is complete garbage, since that's probably what's inside the tin. But my family have guinea pigs, so I am very well aware of the cost of giving them nice vegetables to eat. One man in New York, he likes to feed his rabbits romaine lettuces, and he used to be able to afford it when they were $1.99, but he says now they're $3.59 for a head of romaine lettuce. He said the cost of pelleted rabbit food at Petco, one of the biggest pet food distributors, has risen over the last 2 years, but he has no intention of letting inflation get in the way of his pet's health and nutrition. I mean, he said he'll do anything for his rabbits. And to be honest, that's exactly what we feel about our guinea pigs.